Welcome to the Alpha Mediumship Academy podcast, a space for intuition, mediumship, and spiritual growth. I'm Joy L, and each week we explore conscious development, awareness, and the deeper side of spiritual experience. So wherever you are, settle in and let's begin. I think one of the reasons people become so confused in spiritual development is because nobody really explains the difference between intuition and mediumship in a clear, normal, grounded way. Everything just gets grouped together into psychic, spiritual, sensitive, gifted, energy, and people are expected to somehow figure out what all that means internally on their own, which honestly can become very confusing very quickly because those experiences do not all feel the same. And they do not function the same way internally either. But when you first start becoming more aware, everything can feel spiritually significant at once. Every feeling, every coincidence, every sudden thought, every emotional shift, every strange dream, every strong reaction, and your mind starts trying to organize all of it immediately, which sounds reasonable in theory until you realize your internal world has basically become a full-time investigative documentary narrated by your nervous system, and suddenly you're sitting there at midnight trying to determine whether you picked up on energy, had an intuitive insight, received spirit communication, remembered something subconsciously, projected emotionally, or just desperately need sleep. Which honestly, sometimes it's the last one. And I think that's important to admit because spiritual conversations online can become so serious that people start feeling afraid to acknowledge how human this process actually is. But development is human, messy human, not polished human, not floating above earth, enlightened, being human, just trying to understand your own awareness while also forgetting why you walked into the kitchen human. That's much closer to reality. And I remember there were periods early in my own development where I genuinely struggled to separate intuition from mediumship because internally everything just felt like awareness. And when you don't understand the texture of different kinds of awareness, everything blends together. Thoughts, feelings, impressions, images, emotional reactions, sudden knowing, atmospheres, it all starts happening in the same internal space. So naturally, the mind starts asking, what was that? Where did that come from? Was that me? Was that intuition? Was that spirit? Was that imagination? Was I right? Am I overthinking this? And honestly, after a while, the mental exhaustion isn't even coming from the perception itself. It's coming from the constant interpretation. Because interpretation is tiring, especially when you feel pressure to get everything correct immediately. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions people have is believing that intuition and mediumship should feel obviously different right away. Like, intuition arrives wearing one name tag and mediumship arrives wearing another. But real perception is much subtler than that, much quieter. And because it's quiet, people often miss it, or they overcomplicate it. Sometimes both simultaneously, which is honestly impressive when you think about it. The human mind really is committed to making simple things complicated sometimes. So let's slow this down completely because I think people hear these words constantly without anyone ever really explaining what they mean experientially. And experience matters, not just terminology, because you can memorize spiritual language all day long and still not actually understand your own awareness clearly. And I think that's what happens to a lot of people. They learn words before they learn observation. So everything becomes energy, downloads, messages, signs, vibrations, which can sound very spiritual and very impressive, but internally they're still sitting there thinking, okay, but what am I actually feeling right now? And honestly, I think that question is much more important than sounding spiritually advanced. Because real development is not about collecting mystical vocabulary. It's about understanding your own perception honestly. And sometimes, honestly, is much less dramatic than people expect. Because intuition and mediumship can overlap in certain ways. Both involve awareness, both involve information arriving outside of normal linear thinking. Both can feel subtle. Both can feel strange at first. And both can absolutely make you question yourself in the beginning, especially if you're someone who naturally overthinks, which many sensitive people do. Because once awareness increases, the mind suddenly believes it has become head of investigations for the universe. Everything becomes, what does this mean? Why did I think that? Wait, was that important? Should I write this down? Should I ignore this? Am I intuitive? Or do I just need electrolytes? Honestly, sometimes the answer is electrolytes and sleep and grounding. Not every spiritual crisis is actually spiritual. Sometimes your nervous system is just exhausted and trying its best. And I think this is why discernment matters so much. Because when people first become more aware, everything can start feeling equally significant. Every feeling feels important, every coincidence feels loaded, every emotional reaction starts looking symbolic. And the mind begins trying to connect everything into one giant spiritual conspiracy board internally, which can become very mentally loud very quickly. And I remember going through phases where I genuinely thought, I need to understand every single thing I'm perceiving immediately. And honestly, that mindset made everything more confusing because pressure creates noise, urgency creates noise, fear of getting it wrong creates noise. And suddenly, instead of observing your awareness, you're wrestling with it constantly, trying to force clarity before clarity is actually ready to form. And I think what helped me most eventually was realizing that perception has texture. And I know that sounds like a strange way to describe it, but it's true. Different kinds of awareness feel differently internally once you stop panicking and start observing more carefully. Intuition has a certain quality. Emotion has a certain quality. Fear has a certain quality. Mediumistic impressions have their own quality too. And development becomes less about becoming more spiritual and more about quietly learning the difference between internal states, which is honestly much less glamorous than social media makes it look, but much more useful. Because social media spirituality sometimes makes it seem like development is just constant certainty and cosmic revelation. Meanwhile, real development often looks like sitting quietly with your own thoughts, observing patterns over time, questioning your reactions honestly, learning emotional regulation, realizing you were projecting sometimes, realizing you were right sometimes, and slowly learning the difference between the two, which is much more human and honestly much healthier. And I think another reason people confuse intuition and mediumship is because they expect mediumship to feel dramatically external. Like suddenly there will be thunder in the background and a spirit will walk into the room and formally introduce themselves. And honestly, if that happens, I would personally also need a moment. That would be a lot. But real mediumistic perception is often much subtler than people imagine, which is why beginners frequently dismiss it at first. Because they're expecting fireworks, and awareness often arrives more quietly than that. And intuition can actually feel much louder emotionally sometimes. That surprises people because intuition is often connected to your own internal system, your body, your emotions, your subconscious pattern recognition, your nervous system, your awareness of subtle environmental changes. So intuitive feelings can feel deeply personal, strong, immediate, emotionally charged sometimes, especially if you're emotionally sensitive already. Whereas mediumistic impressions can sometimes feel oddly neutral, not cold, just observational, almost like information passing through awareness without emotional buildup attached to it yet. And I think that's one of the strangest parts in the beginning. The thing people expect to feel the most dramatic can actually feel surprisingly calm internally. And honestly, I think many people miss their clearest moments because they're expecting intensity instead of clarity. But intensity and clarity are not the same thing. And that realization changes almost everything in development. Because once you stop chasing intensity, you start observing more honestly. And when observation becomes more honest, discernment starts becoming possible. Naturally, not forced. And I think one of the most healing things for people to understand is that confusion in the beginning is normal. Not because you're failing, because human awareness is layered. You are interpreting subtle experiences through memory, emotion, personality, language, expectation, fear, belief systems, previous experiences, all while trying to stay objective, which honestly is a very ambitious task for the human mind, especially at 1 a.m. after 3 coffees and no grounding whatsoever. So I think people need to be gentler with themselves in this process, because awareness develops much more clearly through observation than through panic. And the more pressure you remove from needing immediate certainty, the easier it becomes to actually recognize what you're experiencing clearly. So let's really talk about intuition for a minute. Not the social media version, not the dramatic version, the actual lived experience of it. Because I think intuition gets described in ways that are so vague sometimes that people end up more confused afterward than before. People say things like, "You'll just know," which sounds profound for about 3 seconds until you're the person sitting there wondering, okay, but how will I know? And honestly, that's a fair question, because intuition usually doesn't arrive like a movie scene. It's often much quieter than people expect. Subtler, more ordinary almost. And I think that's one of the reasons people dismiss their intuition constantly, because they're expecting something louder. For me, intuition often feels internal, like something rising from within my own awareness rather than entering it from outside. And it can show up in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's a sudden knowing, a feeling that something is off, noticing a pattern before there's visible evidence, sensing tension in someone before they say anything, feeling emotionally uneasy around something your logical mind thinks should be fine. And what's interesting is that intuition often makes sense later, not always immediately. And I think highly intuitive people are usually processing far more information subconsciously than they realize consciously. Your awareness notices tone shifts, facial expressions, hesitation, inconsistencies, atmosphere, emotional undercurrents, sometimes before your logical mind catches up to what your nervous system already noticed, which is why intuition can feel mysterious. Not because nothing logical is happening, but because part of the process is occurring beneath conscious awareness. And honestly, I think some of the most intuitive people I've met are also the people most likely to dismiss themselves because intuitive information doesn't always arrive with proof attached to it immediately. And that can feel uncomfortable, especially if you're someone who likes certainty or evidence or stability or literally just wants your brain to calm down for 5 minutes. And I remember having moments where I sensed something very strongly internally, but had absolutely no external evidence yet. And that's such a strange experience because part of you feels, I know this. And another part immediately goes, okay, but do we though? And then the internal debate begins, which honestly feels like having two versions of yourself in a meeting that neither one prepared for. And intuition can also feel deeply emotional sometimes. Not because emotion and intuition are the same thing, but because intuition often moves through your emotional system. Especially if you're naturally sensitive, so people can confuse intuitive awareness with emotional intensity very easily in the beginning. And I think this is why emotionally sensitive people sometimes become spiritually overwhelmed, because when you feel everything deeply, your mind starts assuming everything carries deep meaning too. And after a while, that becomes exhausting because now every interaction feels loaded, every feeling feels symbolic. Every dream feels like it needs interpretation immediately. And suddenly, your entire existence starts feeling like a puzzle your nervous system is trying to solve 24 hours a day, which is not peaceful at all. And honestly, I think one of the healthiest things I ever learned was realizing not every feeling requires immediate interpretation. That changed a lot for me. Because before that, I thought development meant understanding everything instantly. Every impression, every emotion, every shift immediately. And the more pressure I put on myself to interpret everything perfectly, the noisier my internal world became. Because intuition actually becomes clearer when you stop grabbing at it constantly. It's a bit like trying to look at water while aggressively splashing your hands around in it. You're creating distortion while trying to force clarity. And I think many sensitive people accidentally do that internally, not because they're doing something wrong, but because they care deeply about understanding what they're experiencing. And I think intuition also has a very grounded side that people don't talk about enough. Because intuition is not always mystical. Sometimes intuition is practical, very practical. Like, I should not trust this situation. Something feels inconsistent here. I need to leave. I don't think this person is being honest. I think I'm ignoring something important. And honestly, a lot of intuitive information is less glamorous than people expect. It's not always cosmic revelations from the universe. Sometimes it's literally, please stop ignoring obvious red flags, which spiritually sounds much less exciting, but is probably more useful for more people's lives. And I also think people confuse intuition with fear, sometimes because both can create strong bodily reactions. But fear usually feels urgent, tight, pressured. Intuition, even when it's strong, often feels cleaner somehow, quieter underneath the feeling itself. And that distinction takes time to recognize, not because you're incapable of recognizing it, but because self-observation is a skill. And most people were never taught how to observe themselves clearly without immediately reacting to everything they feel. And honestly, I think modern life makes intuition harder to hear sometimes too, because people are overstimulated constantly. Notifications, noise, stress, content, opinions, fear, distraction. The nervous system rarely gets quiet anymore. And intuition often speaks much more softly than the rest of the world does. Which is why I think grounded stillness matters so much in development. Not because stillness is spiritual in some performative way, but because awareness becomes easier to recognize when your internal world is not in complete chaos all the time. And honestly, I think some people are not disconnected from intuition at all. I think they're just overwhelmed. There's a difference, a very big difference. And over time, intuition starts feeling less like magic and more like a deeper relationship with your own awareness. And honestly, I think that's a much healthier way to understand it, because then you stop treating intuition like this mysterious performance you need to perfect and start understanding it as part of how awareness naturally communicates through you, quietly, subtly, consistently. And I think once people realize that, a lot of pressure starts dropping because they stop trying to force dramatic experiences all the time. They stop assuming they're failing if something doesn't feel cinematic enough. And they start paying attention to the smaller things, subtle knowing, quiet discomfort, recurring patterns, emotional shifts, internal nudges, moments that don't logically make sense until later. And honestly, those quieter moments are often the ones that end up mattering the most. Because intuition is rarely trying to impress you, it's usually trying to inform you. And that's a very different energy. One feels performative, the other feels grounded. And I think intuitive people sometimes accidentally invalidate themselves because what they perceive feels too normal. Like they expect real intuition to feel more supernatural somehow. Meanwhile, their awareness has probably been speaking to them quietly for years. They just kept dismissing it because it didn't arrive dramatically enough. And honestly, I think that happens more than people realize because human beings tend to trust intensity more than subtlety, even though subtle things are often more accurate. Which is interesting when you think about it. The mind really does love theatrics sometimes, even internally. And I remember realizing at one point that many of my clearest intuitive moments were actually the calmest ones, the least emotional, the least dramatic, the least mentally chaotic. And that completely changed how I understood awareness. Because suddenly I stopped asking, how do I feel more? And started asking, how do I observe more clearly? And those are completely different questions. And I think that shift is where intuition starts becoming much more grounded. Not less meaningful, not less deep, just less emotionally tangled, more honest, more stable, and honestly, much easier to live with. So when it comes to mediumship, this is where things become a little more difficult to explain with language, because mediumship still moves through your own mind, your own awareness, your own emotional system. So in the beginning, it can feel very easy to question whether something is coming from you or being perceived through you. And honestly, I think almost everybody goes through that phase, that internal, was that actually something or was that my imagination? Conversation? Repeatedly? Sometimes aggressively. And I think people assume that once someone develops mediumship, they suddenly become completely certain all the time. But real development usually feels much more observational than that. More, I'm noticing this. Less, I know everything with absolute certainty. And honestly, I distrust people who sound overly certain about every internal experience they have. Because human perception is layered, always, no matter how developed someone is. And for me personally, mediumistic information tends to feel different from intuition because it doesn't always feel emotionally connected to me. That's one of the first distinctions I started noticing. Intuition often feels connected to my own system, my awareness, my emotions, my instincts, my subconscious noticing, whereas mediumistic impressions can sometimes feel more like information appearing in awareness without the same emotional buildup attached to it. Almost like here instead of I feel, and that's subtle but important. And honestly, some of the clearest moments can feel surprisingly ordinary while they're happening, which I think confuses people because everyone expects mediumship to feel dramatic, like suddenly the room temperature changes and violins start playing in the background. Meanwhile, sometimes it's literally just a sudden image, a name, a feeling, a phrase, or a piece of information that arrives very quietly. And your logical mind immediately tries to explain it away because it didn't feel theatrical enough. And I think beginners especially expect mediumship to feel emotionally overwhelming all the time. But honestly, emotional intensity can sometimes make perception less clear. Because once emotion becomes very loud internally, interpretation starts speeding up. And then the mind begins filling in gaps automatically, which is very human. Human beings are constantly trying to complete patterns and create meaning. That's part of how the brain works. And this is why discernment matters so much in mediumship. Because receiving information and interpreting information are two completely different processes, and people often merge them together without realizing it. For example, you may receive a very simple impression, but then the mind immediately starts building an entire story around it. And suddenly you've gone from, I noticed something, to I have created a full emotional documentary with theories, symbolism, and 3 possible timelines, which honestly the mind loves to do, especially when something feels meaningful. And I remember realizing at one point how quickly the mind wants to move away from observation and into conclusion. It wants certainty immediately. It wants explanation immediately. It wants everything organized instantly. But mediumistic perception often does not arrive in fully organized language. Sometimes it arrives symbolically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes visually, sometimes through sudden knowing, sometimes through fragments. And learning how to sit with fragments without forcing completion too quickly is actually a huge part of development. Because honestly, sometimes the clearest thing you can say internally is, I'm noticing this, but I don't fully understand it yet. And that takes maturity, especially spiritually, because there's so much pressure sometimes to sound completely certain all the time. But certainty and clarity are not always the same thing. And I think one of the healthiest things a person can develop in mediumship is the ability to observe without immediately exaggerating what they're experiencing. Not minimizing it either, just observing honestly, because both extremes create distortion. Some people dismiss everything. Some people believe everything immediately, and neither one creates grounded discernment. And honestly, I think mediumship becomes much calmer over time than people expect. Not less meaningful, just less chaotic internally. Because eventually you stop reacting to every impression with, oh my God, what does this mean? And instead you start recognizing different textures of awareness more naturally, without so much panic attached to it. And I think that's important because people often assume development means becoming more dramatic spiritually. But honestly, grounded development usually makes people calmer, more stable, more observant, less reactive, not because awareness disappears, but because your relationship to awareness becomes healthier. And honestly, I think that's one of the biggest differences between fantasy and grounded spiritual development. Fantasy spirituality often becomes addicted to intensity. Grounded development becomes more interested in clarity. And those are very different paths internally. And over time, mediumship starts feeling less like proving something extraordinary and more like learning how to observe subtle awareness honestly without interfering with it constantly, which is much quieter than people expect, but honestly, much more real. Now, this is the part that I think confuses almost everybody at some point. Emotion. Because emotions are intelligent. Your body notices things. Your nervous system notices things. Your subconscious notices things. So, emotional reactions can absolutely contain intuitive information sometimes. But not every emotional reaction is intuitive information. And learning that distinction takes time. Usually uncomfortable time, because nobody enjoys realizing, oh, that wasn't intuition. That was anxiety wearing a spiritual costume. Humbling experience, honestly. Very humbling. And I think sensitive people especially struggle with this because they genuinely do feel things deeply, which means emotional intensity can become very convincing internally. If something feels strong, the mind naturally assumes this must be important. And sometimes it is. But sometimes your nervous system is reacting to fear, past experiences, emotional memory, attachment, overstimulation, stress, lack of sleep, too much caffeine, reading 12 spiritual TikToks at midnight, which honestly has probably emotionally destabilized half the internet at this point. And I remember there were moments in my own development where I had to really learn the difference between clear awareness and emotional urgency, because those states can feel similar at first, especially if you're already naturally emotionally sensitive. Emotional urgency usually feels tight, fast, pressured, like your mind is demanding an answer immediately. It wants certainty right now. It wants resolution right now. It wants to solve the feeling instantly. And honestly, emotionally urgent states often create more interpretation than observation, because the mind starts trying to escape uncertainty as quickly as possible. Whereas clearer intuitive states, even strong ones, often have more steadiness underneath them. Not always comfort, but steadiness. And I know that's difficult to explain until you've experienced the difference yourself. But over time, you start noticing it. One state feels emotionally consuming. The other feels more observational, even when it's important. And honestly, I think this is one of the reasons people become spiritually exhausted, because they're trying to interpret every emotional wave as though it's a sacred message requiring immediate decoding. And after a while, your nervous system is just sitting there like, please, I'm begging you, can we relax for 5 minutes? Because once awareness opens up, it becomes very easy to overassign meaning to things. Everything starts feeling symbolic, loaded, potentially important, and the mind begins scanning constantly, which can become exhausting mentally, especially when combined with emotional sensitivity. And honestly, I think some people are not struggling with lack of intuition at all. I think they're struggling with overstimulation. There's a difference, a huge difference, because when the nervous system is overwhelmed, everything starts feeling loud internally. And when everything feels loud, discernment becomes harder. Not impossible, just harder. And I also think people sometimes underestimate how much fear influences interpretation, because fear wants certainty. Fear hates ambiguity. Fear wants immediate answers. So if someone feels emotionally activated, the mind will often rush to create explanations very quickly just to regain a sense of control, even if those explanations are inaccurate, which is very human, not weakness, human. And honestly, I had to learn at some point that not every feeling required an immediate spiritual explanation. That was a big shift for me, because before that, I thought development meant constantly analyzing myself, every feeling, every dream, every reaction, every shift in energy. And eventually it became mentally exhausting because I never allowed myself to simply experience anything without dissecting it immediately afterward. And I think sensitive people do this a lot. They become so internally observant that they accidentally lose rest internally. Everything becomes analysis. And after a while, the nervous system starts living in a constant state of heightened processing, which does not create clarity. It creates fatigue. And honestly, I think grounded spirituality should make people feel more stable over time, not more emotionally chaotic. More aware, yes. More honest, yes. More perceptive, yes. But also calmer, clearer, more emotionally regulated, less reactive to every internal shift. Because awareness without grounding can become overwhelming very quickly. And I think one of the healthiest things a person can learn is you do not need to solve every feeling immediately. You can let things breathe. You can observe without instantly interpreting. You can allow emotions to settle before deciding what they mean. And honestly, that alone creates so much more clarity. Because once emotion settles down, what remains consistent becomes much easier to recognize. And sometimes after emotion settles, you realize, oh, that actually was intuitive. And sometimes you realize, wow, I was emotionally spiraling and absolutely creating theories. Both are valuable observations, honestly, because discernment develops through honesty, not perfection. And I think that's one of the most important things people need to hear in spiritual development. You are not supposed to interpret everything perfectly immediately. You're learning. You're observing. You're developing a relationship with your own awareness over time. And that process is much more human than people often allow it to be. So this is where everything we just talked about starts to come together in a very real way. Because when someone first begins developing awareness, there's usually a strong desire to understand everything immediately, which makes sense. If you suddenly start noticing more internally, of course your mind wants to figure out what it all means. That's a very natural response. The problem is that urgency can actually create more confusion than clarity. Because in the beginning, most people are trying to interpret experiences faster than they're actually observing them. And those are very different processes. Observation is, what am I noticing? Interpretation is, what does this mean? And beginners often jump straight into interpretation before observation is even complete. And I remember doing this constantly. I would feel something, notice something, sense something, and immediately try to define it, label it, understand it, categorize it, explain it, preferably within 5 seconds, which is ambitious, very ambitious. And the issue with that is the mind starts filling in gaps automatically because the brain does not enjoy uncertainty. It wants completion, it wants resolution, it wants answers. So if you don't give it clear information yet, it will create its own. Confidently, sometimes incorrectly, but confidently. And I think this is where people start blending intuition, imagination, emotional projection, fear, expectation, all together without realizing it. Not because they're doing something wrong, but because they're moving too quickly through the process. And honestly, I think beginners assume development is about becoming more accurate immediately. But real development is actually about becoming more honest first. Honest about what you're actually experiencing, what you're unsure about, what you might be projecting, what feels clear, what feels emotional, what feels uncertain. And that level of honesty is not always comfortable because it's much easier to say, I know exactly what this means, than it is to say, I'm noticing something, but I don't fully understand it yet. But the second one is usually closer to truth. And I think there's also a subtle pressure in spiritual spaces to sound confident, to sound certain, to sound like you have everything figured out. And honestly, that pressure can push people to interpret experiences faster than they naturally should, which creates distortion because clarity doesn't come from speed. It comes from consistency, from observing patterns over time, from noticing what repeats, from seeing what holds up after emotion settles. And I remember at one point realizing that my clearest insights were rarely the ones I rushed. They were the ones I allowed to sit for a moment, the ones I didn't immediately try to force into meaning, the ones I came back to later and recognized more clearly. And I think that's something people don't hear enough. You are allowed to not know immediately. You're allowed to observe without defining. You are allowed to let something exist without turning it into a full explanation right away. Because honestly, rushing interpretation is like trying to read a sentence while someone is still writing it. You're going to misunderstand parts of it. Not because you're incapable, but because the process isn't finished yet. And I also think beginners sometimes underestimate how much expectation influences perception. If you expect something to be mediumship, your mind may start interpreting experiences in that direction. If you expect something to be intuitive, your mind may lean that way. And that doesn't mean the experience isn't real. It just means interpretation is being influenced. And this is why grounded development requires a certain level of patience, which I know is not the most exciting answer. People want, how do I know instantly? And the honest answer is, you don't always. And that's okay. Because over time, something starts to shift. You begin recognizing patterns, you begin noticing differences, you begin understanding your own internal language more clearly. Not because you forced clarity, but because you allowed yourself to observe long enough for clarity to form naturally. And honestly, I think one of the biggest turning points in development is when you stop trying to be right all the time and start trying to be accurate over time. Those are very different goals. Being right is immediate. Accuracy is built. And accuracy requires patience, observation, self-awareness, honesty, and the ability to sit with uncertainty without panicking, which is not something most people are taught how to do. But once you develop that, everything becomes much clearer. Not instantly, but consistently. And honestly, much less exhausting. Okay, this is the part that nobody really wants to talk about openly, but it's also the part that once you understand it, everything starts making a lot more sense. Your brain is extremely creative, like aggressively helpful sometimes, almost too helpful. Because alongside intuition and mediumship, you also have imagination, memory, emotional projection, expectation, pattern, completion, all running at the same time inside the same system, which is you. So, of course, things get mixed up sometimes. And I think this is where people get nervous because they think, if imagination is involved at all, does that mean none of this is real? And the answer is no. That's not how this works. Imagination is not the enemy. It's part of the mechanism. Because everything you perceive still has to move through your mind, your language, your memory, your symbolism, your personal references. So even real perception gets translated through your internal system, which means imagination can be involved in how something appears without it being made up. And that distinction is really important. But your brain also likes to finish things quickly, sometimes too quickly. You'll notice something small and your mind goes, perfect, I'll take it from here. And suddenly you've gone from one subtle impression to a full storyline with background music and emotional meaning in about 6 seconds. And honestly, I remember catching myself doing this and being like, okay, we started with one piece of information. Why are we now writing a trilogy? Because the mind loves completion. It hates open loops. So it fills gaps automatically. And this is where people start blending perception, imagination, interpretation, without realizing where one ends and the other begins. And again, not because they're doing something wrong, because this is how the brain works. And honestly, once I understood that, I actually relaxed a lot more because I stopped trying to force everything into this must be 100% external and perfect, and instead started looking at what part of this feels observed and what part feels added. That question changes everything because there's a difference between something arriving versus you building on it. And that difference becomes clearer the more you slow down. And I think one of the most helpful things you can do is start noticing when your mind speeds up. Because when interpretation speeds up, imagination usually jumps in. Not in a bad way, just in a very enthusiastic way. Like your brain is basically saying, don't worry, I've got this. I'll make it make sense immediately. And you're like, that's not what I asked for, but okay. And honestly, this is why grounded development requires patience. Because real perception often arrives in small pieces, fragments, impressions, simple information, not fully formed, emotionally dramatic narratives. And I think beginners sometimes assume if it's real, it should come through perfectly. But in reality, clarity often builds over time, not instantly. And I also had to learn to separate money from perception because memory is powerful. And sometimes your brain will pull from past experiences, images, conversations, and layer them into what you're perceiving. Again, not because it's fake, because your mind is trying to interpret using what it already knows. And the same thing happens with emotional projection. If you're feeling something strongly, your mind may start assigning meaning to what you're perceiving based on that emotion, which can feel very real, very convincing, and sometimes very inaccurate. And honestly, I think this is where people either become overly skeptical of themselves or believe everything immediately. And neither extreme is helpful. Because if you doubt everything, you shut down awareness. If you believe everything, you lose discernment. So development lives in the middle, which I know is not the most exciting answer, but it is the most accurate one. And I remember realizing at one point that I didn't need to eliminate imagination. I needed to understand it, work with it, recognize when it was assisting and when it was leading. Because imagination can actually help translate perception, but it shouldn't override it. And learning that balance takes time. And honestly, humor helps here a lot. Because if you can catch your brain doing something and laugh a little, everything softens. Instead of, oh no, I did something wrong, it becomes, okay, that escalated quickly. And that shift matters. Because development should not feel like constant pressure. It should feel like increasing awareness, increasing honesty, increasing clarity over time. And the more honest you are about what your mind is doing, the clearer your perception becomes. Not overnight, but steadily. And honestly, your brain isn't trying to sabotage you. It's trying to help. It's just sometimes a little enthusiastic about it. So after all of this, intuition, emotion, imagination, projection, mediumship, this is where everything starts to come together. Discernment. And I think people imagine discernment as this moment where you suddenly become completely certain about everything. Like one day you wake up and you're just like, perfect. I now understand every internal experience with 100% accuracy. That has not been my experience at all. Discernment is much quieter than that, and honestly, much less dramatic. It's not, I know everything. It's more, I recognize this. It becomes familiarity with your own patterns, your own mind, your own emotional responses, your own way of perceiving. And that familiarity builds over time, not overnight. Because what starts happening is you begin to notice differences in texture, subtle differences. But once you notice them, you can't unsee them. Like you start recognizing when something feels emotionally charged versus steady, when something feels like it's coming from you versus moving through you, when your mind is building something versus observing something, when fear is driving interpretation versus calm awareness. And it's not always perfect. You'll still question yourself sometimes. You'll still have moments where you're like, wait, what just happened there? That doesn't go away completely, but the frequency of confusion starts decreasing. And honestly, one of the biggest shifts is that you stop reacting to everything immediately. That alone changes so much, because in the beginning, every experience feels like it needs an instant answer. Later on, you can sit with something and go, okay, I'm noticing this. Let me just stay with it for a second, without spiraling, without overanalyzing, without turning it into a full investigation. And I think that's what makes development start to feel calmer, not because awareness disappears, but because your relationship to awareness changes. You stop chasing certainty and start trusting observation. And I remember realizing at one point that I didn't actually need to label everything immediately. That was a huge shift, because before that, I thought clarity meant I can explain everything instantly. But real clarity felt more like, I understand what I'm noticing, even if I don't have all the answers yet. And that's a very different experience internally. And honestly, I think discernment also includes being honest when something isn't clear. Which sounds simple, but is actually not easy for people. Because there's this subtle pressure to always know, to always have an answer, to always be certain. But sometimes the most accurate thing you can say is, I'm not sure yet. And that's not weakness, that's awareness. And over time, something interesting happens. You stop needing everything to feel intense to trust it. You stop needing emotional confirmation all the time. You stop needing things to feel dramatic to believe they're real. And instead, you start noticing consistency, stability, clarity that remains over time, impressions that don't change when your emotions settle in. And those things become more trustworthy. And I think one of the biggest differences between early development and more grounded development is this. In the beginning, people trust what feels strongest. Later on, people trust what stays consistent. And those are very different ways of navigating awareness. And honestly, discernment makes everything less exhausting because you're no longer trying to solve every internal experience immediately. You're not reacting to everything. You're not questioning every single thought or feeling constantly. You're just noticing. And understanding builds from there. And I think that's what people are actually looking for. Not perfection, not constant certainty, but clarity that feels stable and awareness that doesn't overwhelm them anymore. And that's what discernment gives you over time. Not instantly, but steadily. And honestly, it makes the whole process feel a lot more human and a lot less chaotic. So, if we bring all of this together, intuition, mediumship, emotion, imagination, interpretation, what you start to realize is that none of this is actually about becoming something completely different. It's about understanding what's already happening more clearly. And I think that's where a lot of pressure starts to fall away. Because people come into this thinking, I need to develop something. And in some ways, yes. But in a lot of ways, you're actually learning how to recognize and organize what's already there. Because your awareness has been working your entire life. You've been noticing things your whole life. You've been feeling things, sensing things, picking up on things long before you had language for it. Now, you're just slowing it down enough to understand it. And I think one of the most important things to remember is this. You do not need to rush your awareness. You don't need to force clarity. You don't need to interpret every single experience immediately. Because the more you rush, the more your mind starts filling in gaps. The more noise gets created. The more confusing everything feels. And honestly, I think a lot of people are not lacking intuition or awareness at all. They're just overwhelmed by trying to process everything too quickly. And once that pressure drops, things start to settle. Not perfectly, not instantly, but noticeably. And I think that's the shift people feel when development becomes more grounded. It stops feeling like, I need to figure everything out right now, and starts feeling more like, I can observe this, and understanding will come. And that creates a completely different internal experience. More space, more calm, more trust. And I think if there's one thing I would want you to take from this episode, it's this. You're allowed to not know immediately. You're allowed to observe without labeling. You're allowed to take your time understanding your own awareness. Because intuition and mediumship are not things you force into clarity. They become clearer through observation, patience, honesty, grounding, and experience over time. And honestly, most people are doing much better than they think. They just don't trust themselves yet. And that's something that builds, not something you have to pretend to have right now. So if you've been feeling confused, overwhelmed, unsure, like everything feels important at once, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It usually just means your awareness is opening faster than your system has learned to organize it. And that's something you can develop calmly over time. And honestly, it gets a lot easier once you stop fighting yourself so much in the process. Thank you for being here with me today. If this episode resonated with you, you can continue your development through Alpha Mediumship Academy using the link in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Until next time, stay aware, stay grounded, and trust yourself a little more than you did yesterday. I'll see you in the next episode.